In just 4 minutes, 89 forced doping victims and 12 executed athletes were about to destroy North Korea's Olympic dreams forever. Moon Jae-in didn't expect the hearing room to fall completely silent. Thomas Bach didn't expect evidence this damning. Cameras captured every moment of horror. The International Olympic Committee watched as decades of sports diplomacy crumbled under documented proof of systematic human rights violations disguised as athletic achievement. What did the former South Korean president reveal about Kim Jong Un's doping conspiracy that made the IOC ban an entire nation in 4 minutes? March 23, 10:17 a.m. Central European Time. The International Olympic Committee headquarters in Lausanne, Switzerland hummed with unusual tension as security personnel checked credentials with unprecedented thoroughness. Inside the marble-floored hearing chamber, representatives from 206 national Olympic committees gathered for what insiders were calling the most significant disciplinary proceeding in Olympic history. At stake was not just medals or records, but the fundamental integrity of international sports competition. Moon Jae-in entered the chamber with the measured dignity of someone who had spent 5 years as president of South Korea navigating the most complex diplomatic challenges on the Korean peninsula. Now 73 years old, the former human rights lawyer had accepted a special appointment as witness in an investigation that threatened to expose systematic abuse hidden behind Olympic pageantry. In his hands, he carried a leather briefcase containing 340 pages of medical documentation that would soon devastate careers and end North Korea's Olympic participation indefinitely. Beside him walked Dr. Lee Sun-hee, a woman whose presence in Lausanne represented extraordinary courage. The former North Korean sports physician had defected 18 months earlier, smuggling classified documents that detailed the most comprehensive state-sponsored doping program since East Germany's systematic cheating during the Cold War. Her hands trembled slightly as she took her seat at the witness table, knowing that family members still in Pyongyang would face consequences for her testimony. IOC President Thomas Bach called the emergency session to order with unusual solemnity. The German lawyer who had himself won Olympic gold in fencing understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Distinguished members of the Olympic movement, he began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. We convene this extraordinary disciplinary hearing to examine allegations of systematic doping, human rights violations, and manipulation of Olympic competition by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In the North Korean delegation section, 3 officials sat rigid with diplomatic hostility. Sports Minister Kim Il-guk, a career party loyalist who had overseen Olympic programs for 12 years, maintained an expression of contempt mixed with barely concealed nervousness. The intelligence reports had warned that defector testimony was coming, but the regime had assumed intimidation and denials would suffice as defense strategies. Moon Jae-in was invited to present his testimony first. He stood slowly, adjusting reading glasses before opening the briefcase with deliberate ceremony that signaled the importance of what would follow. President Bach, distinguished committee members, he began in English, his pronunciation carrying the careful precision of someone speaking a second language on matters of profound importance. I come before you not as a politician but as someone who spent decades defending human rights before entering public service. The chamber's acoustic design ensured his words carried clearly to every corner. What I will share today is not speculation or political accusation. It is documented evidence of systematic abuse conducted under the guise of athletic excellence. Moon gestured to Dr. Lee, who stood beside him looking small but determined against the institutional grandeur surrounding them. Dr. Lee Sun-hee served for 11 years as a sports physician in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's Olympic training program. She worked directly with athletes preparing for international competition, and what she witnessed drove her to risk everything to bring the truth to light. Dr. Lee's voice was barely above a whisper as she began speaking in Korean, with simultaneous translation provided through headsets. In March 2015, I was assigned to the Olympic Training Center in Pyongyang. On my first day, I was given instructions that violated everything I had learned in medical school. I was told that athlete health was secondary to national glory. That performance enhancement through any means necessary was not just acceptable but required. The translation made her words even more chilling in their clinical detachment. I was provided with injectable testosterone, human growth hormone, erythropoietin, and numerous substances I did not recognize. Athletes as young as 14 years old were brought to my medical office. I was ordered to administer these substances regardless of the health consequences. Moon opened a folder, removing documents bearing official North Korean government seals. These are medical records that Dr. Lee maintained despite orders to destroy them, he said, holding up pages covered in Korean text and medical notations. They document 89 athletes across 12 different sports who were subjected to forced doping between 2015 and 2024. The number landed with devastating impact. 89 athletes over 9 years represented not isolated incidents but systematic policy implemented at the highest levels of North Korean sports administration. But what makes this evidence particularly compelling, Moon continued, is the documentation of consequences when athletes refused or when their bodies could no longer tolerate the substances they were being forced to consume. He removed another set of documents, these bearing the red stamps of North Korean Internal Security Services. 12 athletes who either refused doping protocols or whose performance declined despite chemical enhancement were classified as enemies of the state. He paused, letting the implications sink in. All 12 were executed between 2016 and 2023. Their families were sent to political prison camps. The chamber erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs. IOC members who had spent careers celebrating athletic achievement were now confronting evidence that Olympic participation had literally become a matter of life and death for North Korean athletes. Sports Minister Kim Il-guk shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. "This is fabricated propaganda from a traitor and a puppet government," he shouted, his voice cracking with barely controlled fury. "We reject these lies completely." President Bok banged his gavel sharply. "Minister Kim, you will have opportunity to present your defense. Please remain seated until called upon." Moon Jae-in continued with prosecutorial calm, undeterred by the outburst. The executions were not random acts of cruelty. They were deliberate policy designed to ensure absolute compliance with doping protocols. Athletes understood that refusing chemical enhancement meant death not just for themselves but for their entire families. Dr. Lee removed a small flash drive from her jacket pocket, holding it up so cameras could capture the gesture. On this device are medical records, training schedules, and photographic evidence documenting the systematic doping program. But perhaps most damning are the recorded conversations between sports officials and medical personnel discussing how to avoid international detection. An IOC technical officer inserted the drive into a computer connected to large displays around the chamber. What appeared on screen made several members visibly recoil. Medical charts showing dangerous hormone levels, photographs of injection sites covering young athletes' bodies, and most chilling, a spreadsheet titled Performance Enhancement Schedule Olympic Cycle 2020. The spreadsheet listed athletes by name, sport, substances administered, and dosages that would have made experienced pharmacologists gasp. Moon began reading from the projected document. Female figure skater, age 16, weekly injections of 300 mg testosterone, 50 international units human growth hormone, 8,000 units erythropoietin. Male speed skater, age 19, daily injections of anabolic steroids at dosages 3 times the recommended medical maximum. But the spreadsheet contained an additional column that transformed medical misconduct into crimes against humanity. The final column was labeled family status. Beside each athlete's name was information about parents, siblings, and extended family members. The message was clear: athletic performance was guaranteed through hostage-taking of loved ones. Moon's voice hardened with moral outrage. Kim Jong Un's regime did not create Olympic athletes. It created prisoners who competed under threat of execution. These were not sports programs. These were forced labor camps where the labor happened to involve athletic performance. President Bok looked visibly shaken as he reviewed documents being passed to senior IOC officials. The technical violations of World Anti-Doping Agency protocols were obvious and damning, but the human rights implications transcended sports governance into fundamental questions of Olympic values. Dr. Lee provided additional testimony that made the systematic nature of abuse undeniable. Every athlete in international competition programs received identical instructions, she explained through translation. "We were told that medals belonged to the supreme leader, not to athletes. That failure was political betrayal. That chemical enhancement was patriotic duty." She described the medical consequences of forced doping with clinical precision that made the human cost even more devastating. Athletes experienced liver damage, cardiac problems, hormonal disruptions that would affect them for life. Female athletes lost menstrual cycles. Male athletes developed testicular atrophy. The youngest athletes, some barely teenagers, suffered developmental problems from being subjected to adult hormone regimens. "I treated a 17-year-old gymnast who begged me to stop the injections because she was experiencing heart palpitations," Dr. Lee said, her voice breaking. "I reported her concerns to my supervisors. She was removed from the program. I later learned she and her family were sent to Camp 14. I never saw her again." The testimony's power came from its specificity and emotional restraint. Dr. Lee was not performing. She was bearing witness to atrocities she had participated in under duress, carrying guilt that would haunt her forever. Moon Jae-in introduced the final category of evidence that would prove impossible for the IOC to ignore. We also have testimony from North Korean intelligence operatives who defected with knowledge of the program's strategic purposes, he said, introducing a new dimension to the scandal. A video screen activated, showing a middle-aged man identified only as witness before security purposes, speaking from an undisclosed location. "I served in North Korean external intelligence for 14 years. The man said in Korean with English subtitles. The Olympic doping program had purposes beyond winning medals. Athletes were trained to gather intelligence on other nations' training methods, to recruit potential assets among international sports communities, and to serve as propaganda tools demonstrating regime superiority. The revelation that Olympic participation served intelligence-gathering purposes added national security dimensions to what was already a devastating human rights case." Sports Minister Kim Il-guk was on his feet again, shouting denunciations in Korean that echoed through the chamber despite attempts to silence him. President Bok ordered security to remove the North Korean delegation if disruptions continued. Moon Jae-in moved toward his conclusion with the methodical precision of someone who understood that credibility depended on evidence, not rhetoric. "President Bok, members of the committee," he said with quiet intensity, "the evidence before you documents systematic state-sponsored doping affecting 89 identified athletes. It documents 12 executions of athletes who refused or failed performance enhancement protocols. It documents the use of family hostage-taking to ensure compliance. And it documents that medals won by North Korean athletes represent not sporting excellence but coerced performance under threat of death." He paused, letting the moral clarity of the situation settle over the chamber. "The question before this committee is whether the Olympic movement will tolerate participation by a nation that treats athletes as expendable tools of state propaganda, that executes those who refuse chemical enhancement, that holds families hostage to ensure compliance with doping protocols." President Bok consulted briefly with senior IOC officials before announcing that the committee would deliberate immediately. The North Korean delegation was offered opportunity to present defense, but Sports Minister Kim stormed from the chamber, declaring the proceedings a political conspiracy orchestrated by the United States and its puppets. The deliberation lasted exactly 4 minutes. When President Bok returned to the podium, his expression carried the weight of a decision that would reshape Olympic participation. After reviewing the evidence presented by President Moon Jae-in and Dr. Lee Sun-hee, and after consideration of our charter obligations to protect athlete welfare and maintain competition integrity, the International Olympic Committee renders the following decision. The silence was absolute as every person in the chamber understood they were witnessing historic judgment. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is hereby banned from participation in all Olympic Games, both summer and winter, indefinitely pending comprehensive reforms and independent verification that state-sponsored doping programs have been completely dismantled and that athletes can compete without threat to their lives or families. The decision represented the most severe sanction in IOC history, not a temporary suspension for specific violations, but complete indefinite exclusion based on human rights grounds that transcended sports governance. Bok continued with additional conditions that made the ban's permanence clear. Reinstatement will require independent inspections of all athletic facilities, interviews with athletes conducted outside North Korean territory, medical examinations to verify cessation of doping programs, and credible assurances that athletes and their families will not face retaliation. The practical impossibility of Kim Jong Un's regime accepting such conditions meant the ban was effectively permanent. North Korea would not compete in the Olympics again unless fundamental regime change occurred. Within hours, the decision dominated global headlines. Associated Press led with IOC bans North Korea over forced doping and athlete executions. BBC emphasized Olympic movement takes unprecedented stand on human rights. Even outlets typically sympathetic to authoritarian regimes struggled to defend a program that executed athletes who refused chemical enhancement. The impact on North Korean propaganda was devastating. Kim Jong Un's regime had invested enormous resources in Olympic programs specifically because international sporting success provided rare opportunities for positive global coverage. Medals won by North Korean athletes were celebrated with massive public events designed to demonstrate regime superiority. The IOC ban destroyed this entire propaganda infrastructure in 4 minutes. For Dr. Lee Sun-hee, the testimony represented both vindication and continued danger. Intelligence services confirmed that North Korean agents had made multiple attempts to locate her since her defection, and the testimony had now made her the regime's most wanted defector. But in interviews following the hearing, she expressed no regret. "If my testimony saves even one athlete from being forced into doping programs or executed for refusing, then everything I risked was worth it." Moon Jae-in returned to Seoul as a hero among human rights advocates but faced criticism from some who argued that diplomatic engagement with North Korea required overlooking such abuses in service of broader peace objectives. His response was characteristically direct: "Peace built on tolerance of state-sponsored murder is not peace worth having." The IOC decision forced other international sports federations to confront similar questions about North Korean participation. Within weeks, FIFA, World Athletics, and the International Ski Federation all announced reviews of North Korea's participation in their competitions. The Olympic ban had created precedent that systematic human rights violations could override traditional assumptions about universal sports participation. Sometimes the strongest condemnation of authoritarian cruelty comes not from politicians or military leaders but from institutions dedicated to principles that transcend politics. The International Olympic Committee had proven that even organizations focused on sports competition can become moral arbiters when confronted with evidence too damning to ignore. Can Olympic values survive when athletes compete under threat of execution? Should international sports organizations look beyond doping violations to the human rights context in which violations occur? Moon Jae-in and Dr. Lee Sun-hee answered these questions by bringing evidence that made evasion impossible. History celebrates athletes who overcome obstacles to achieve Olympic glory, but sometimes the greater courage belongs to those who risk everything to expose the systematic abuse hiding behind medals and national anthems.